The cold wind cut through James' skin as he walked through the dark, decaying streets of the city's rundown district. The shadows of abandoned buildings and the remnants of torn posters on the walls gave off a sense of neglect. He passed through narrow alleys where the smell of garbage and dampness filled the air. However, his mind was far from this desolate scene. His thoughts were focused on numbers, growth charts, and the investment opportunities that this decaying place could offer. The city had once been a thriving commercial hub, but now it seemed like a shell of what it once was. Yet, in James' eyes, every ruined building represented an opportunity, a potential project that could bring significant returns. He was known for transforming forgotten areas into lucrative ventures, and this place, with its worn-out facades and deserted streets, seemed like the perfect challenge. As he moved forward, a light mist began to form, enveloping the ends of the street. He paused for a moment, watching the mist dance around the broken streetlights, his mind still focused on the bright future he planned to carve out. It was at that moment, as he prepared to continue his walk, that his eyes caught a figure huddled against a wall of weathered bricks. At first, he ignored it, considering it just another lost soul in that part of the city. However, something about the person's posture, the way they seemed to blend into the darkness, made him hesitate. His steps faltered, and he looked again more carefully. The face partially covered by a dirty scarf seemed familiar, and then, with a sudden shock, he recognized her. It was Sarah, his ex-wife. Time seemed to stop. He stood still, staring at her, while memories of their marriage, of the promises made and broken, flooded his mind. The last time he had seen her, she was put together, confident, a woman who knew what she wanted out of life. Now, this woman was nothing but a shadow of what she once was. Dressed in old, tattered clothes, she seemed to have lost all the vitality he once admired. Without thinking, he took a step forward, but then stopped. What could he say? How could he explain the decisions that had led him to abandon her? Sarah didn't seem to notice him, giving him time to pull himself together. But before he could decide what to do, an overwhelming feeling of guilt and shame took hold of him. He stepped back, slowly retreating into the shadows, trying to process what he had just seen. Back in his car, James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The vision of Sarah, fragile and helpless, wouldn't leave his mind. He had tried to justify his actions so many times. She was better off without me, he used to tell himself, but now, seeing her in that state, the words felt empty and false. He drove aimlessly, the city streets passing by in a blur. The traffic lights, the distant sound of horns, everything seemed muffled, far away. His mind was trapped in memories of when they were still married, of how he had let himself be seduced by youth and ambition, abandoning everything they had built together for an illusion of happiness. Lily, the young assistant he had chosen instead of Sarah, was everything he thought he wanted back then. Energy, beauty, the promise of a fresh start. But now, years later, he was beginning to realize how superficial his decision had been. And worse, how that choice had affected the woman he once swore to love. He remembered the first few months after the separation, how Sarah had tried to keep in touch, asking for explanations he never had the courage to give. He had ignored her, believing that time would heal everything, that she would move on as he had. But the sight of her that night, lost in the streets, was living proof that he was wrong. The car finally stopped in front of the building where he now lived. Lily, now his partner, was probably at home, waiting for him with a smile he knew was only skin deep. He entered the silent apartment, feeling the weight of the empty luxury that surrounded him. The contrast between his life and Sarah's was almost unbearable. He collapsed onto the sofa, but the comfort of the expensive furniture brought no relief. The silence was broken by the sound of a notification on his phone, but he had no desire to check it. Instead, his mind wandered back to that scene, to the lost look in Sarah's eyes. The feeling of guilt began to transform into a desperate need to do something, anything, to correct the mistakes of the past. He knew that from this moment on, his life couldn't continue on the same path. Something had to change, and he had to find a way to face the abyss that had opened within him. The sun hadn't fully risen on the horizon when James found himself back on the streets of the city. That unexpected encounter with Sarah haunted his thoughts, disrupting his sleep and filling his mind. He knew he couldn't move on without confronting her, without understanding how she had ended up in that situation. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him back to the place where he had first seen her. As he walked through the still deserted streets, he felt the weight of the decisions he had made over the years. Each step seemed to resonate with his guilt. He stopped in front of the same weathered brick building where he had seen her. His eyes scanned the area, and soon he found her again, still huddled against the wall, as if the night hadn't passed. Sarah was awake, but her gaze was empty, as if she were looking at a distant point in time. When James approached, she finally looked up, and for a brief moment, he saw a flicker of recognition. But there was no anger, no explicit pain in her eyes, only a resigned acceptance. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. How could he explain that he never thought things would end up this way? How could he ask for forgiveness when he knew his actions were irreversible? Feeling helpless, he finally managed to murmur her name, a barely audible sound, as if he feared the sound of his own voice. She looked at him for a long time before speaking, her voice rough and low, as if it was difficult to form the words. "I didn't expect to see you here," Sarah said, her tone both curious and indifferent. James took a step forward, trying to find the right words. I didn't know that things were like this," he began, but he realized he sounded empty, insensitive. Sarah shrugged, as if the situation was so common that it no longer bothered her. "We all make choices, don't we? Some good, some bad. And sometimes we have to live with the consequences." James felt the impact of those words like a blow. "I want to help," he finally said, the urgency in his voice evident. "If I had known, I would have done anything to change this." She looked at him for a moment, and then, to his surprise, she laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "Help? With what? Money? A new house? Do you think you can just erase all of this with money?" James felt the weight of the truth in her words. He knew she was right. He had thought that his wealth and success could fix everything, but life wasn't that simple. The pain, the loss, the abandonment, none of it could be resolved with a check. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, feeling more vulnerable than he had ever felt in his life. "But I want to try. I want to do something right at least once." Sarah looked at him with an unreadable expression, as if she was trying to decide whether to believe him or not. "Maybe it's too late for that," she finally said. "But I'm not asking you for anything. If you want to help other people. I've already made peace with this." Her words hit him like a punch in the gut. It wasn't forgiveness, but a kind of resignation that was even harder to bear. He nodded, knowing there was nothing more he could say at that moment. But as he walked away, a new determination began to form within him. Maybe he couldn't correct his past mistakes, but at least he could try to prevent other people from going through what she had gone through. Back at the office, James felt as if he were in another world. The corporate environment, with its clean lines, cutting-edge technology, and glass walls, seemed almost alien compared to the harsh reality he had faced on the streets. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, and the sound of keyboards filled the air, creating a symphony of productivity that used to comfort him but now seemed empty and distant. Lily, always attuned to the smallest details, immediately noticed the change in his behavior. "Is everything okay?" she asked, with a sweet voice that he knew was calculated. She was always focused on work, on the next big opportunity, and she expected him to be as well. He shook his head, trying to push away the thoughts that tormented him. "Yes, everything's fine. Just a bit tired," he lied, though he knew she didn't entirely believe him. "We have a meeting with the investors in an hour," she reminded him, handing over a tablet with the latest numbers. "They're eager to hear about the downtown project. They expect you to seize this opportunity," Lily continued, her tone emphasizing the importance of the upcoming meeting. James glanced at the numbers, graphs, and projections, but they all seemed distant, irrelevant. Sarah's voice still echoed in his mind. How could he focus on making money from an area that, to him, was now laden with so much pain and regret? "Maybe we should postpone the meeting," he said, almost without thinking. "I need more time to evaluate the situation." Lily frowned, surprised. He never postponed meetings, never asked for more time. "This could send the wrong message," she said, trying to be persuasive without seeming critical. "The investors might get nervous. This is the kind of project that could secure our quarter." He knew she was right, but the idea of continuing as if nothing had changed was unbearable. "Tell them I'm reviewing some strategic issues. Reschedule the meeting for tomorrow." She nodded, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. As she left the room, he allowed himself a moment to take a deep breath. He needed to find a way to deal with all of this, to balance the demands of the business world with the emotional whirlwind he was facing. The day dragged on slowly, with each meeting and phone call requiring monumental effort. When he finally got home, he was exhausted, but relief didn't come. The image of Sarah, fragile and helpless, continued to haunt him. He knew that deciding to help others was the right thing to do, but the path ahead wouldn't be easy, especially with the constant pressures from the world he had built for himself. In the days that followed, James immersed himself in a new mission, something he had never done before. He spent hours researching, contacting charities and social workers, trying to understand how he could make a real difference in the lives of people living on the streets. It was a world completely different from the one he was used to, filled with challenges that couldn't be solved with a simple signature or bank transfer. He began drafting a plan to create a foundation, a project that could provide ongoing support to the homeless, not just with shelter and food, but with opportunities for reintegration into society. It was hard work, requiring more than just money. It required time, effort, and above all, a genuine willingness to help. James knew this would mean sacrificing part of his business life. He would have to let go of some projects, spend less time on his businesses, and possibly lose the trust of some investors. But for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something meaningful, something that really mattered. As he worked on the details of the foundation, he encountered resistance, both internally and externally. Internally, he struggled with doubt. Was he trying to buy his redemption? Was he really doing this for the people or just to ease his guilt? Externally, he faced skepticism from his colleagues and business partners, who couldn't understand why he would suddenly divert his efforts to a cause so far removed from his usual focus. Lily was the first to voice her concerns. "Are you really sure about this?" she asked, as they reviewed the plans for the foundation. "This will require a huge commitment, and it could harm other important projects. We can't afford to lose focus now." He looked at her, knowing her concerns were legitimate, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't continue living the way he had been. "I already lost focus before," he said calmly, his words carrying a weight she didn't fully understand. "And it cost me much more than money." She frowned, not fully grasping his meaning, but she knew he was determined. "So, what's the next step?" she asked, accepting that this was a battle she wouldn't win. The next step was putting the idea into practice. He began selling some of his less profitable properties to finance the foundation, and soon the news spread through the market. Rumors that he was leaving the business world began to circulate, causing nervousness among investors and colleagues. But he remained steadfast. Each sale, each meeting to discuss the details of the foundation, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He knew he was sacrificing a lot, but for the first time in a long time he didn't care. He was willing to sacrifice his status, his position in the market, and even part of his fortune if it meant he could help change the lives of people like Sarah. The impact of his actions was soon felt. Some investors began to pull away, worried about the shift in his priorities. Others, intrigued by his new vision, decided to support the project, if only to see where it would lead. Lily, always pragmatic, continued to manage the remaining businesses, but the tension between them grew day by day. The strain caused by the changes in James' life began to reflect in his relationship with Lily. She had become distant, colder, as she watched his plans for the foundation progress, often at the expense of projects that had once been priorities. Their communication became minimal, limited to strictly professional matters. One cold night, after a long meeting about the legal details of the foundation, he returned home exhausted. However, when he opened the door to the apartment, he found an envelope on the table. Inside were copies of documents, financial transactions he recognized, but which had been manipulated to appear illegal. At the end, there was a simple note attached. If you continue down this path, everyone will know the truth. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. James knew that this information could only have come from someone close to him, and Lily was the only one with access to those documents. He felt a mix of anger and disappointment. She, whom he had trusted for so long, was now using his past against him to try to control him. When he confronted her the next day, her expression was calculatedly neutral. "I knew you wouldn't understand," she said without remorse. "It's not about what you did or didn't do. It's about what's best for business. And that foundation isn't the best path. Do you think you can blackmail me?" he asked, his voice low but full of menace. "That I'll just give up everything because you have those papers?" She looked him straight in the eyes. "I don't expect you to give up. I just expect you to make the right decision for everyone. It's not about blackmail, it's about damage control. Think about the people who count on you, the businesses we've built together. It's not worth risking everything for something so uncertain." The coldness in her voice was like a bucket of ice water. He realized he had underestimated her ambition, and now he was paying the price. But he also knew he couldn't back down. Not after everything he had done, not after what he had promised himself. He walked away from her, ignoring the pain of realizing how deeply he had been betrayed. In the days that followed, the situation worsened. Rumors of his downfall in the market intensified, and long-standing partners began to distance themselves. His isolation increased, and Lily made sure it was clear that he was alone on this new path. But despite the betrayal and isolation, he remained focused on the foundation. He knew there was no going back to the life he once considered ideal. The sacrifice was made, and the only thing left was to move forward, even if it meant losing everything he had built over the years. Days passed in a rhythm almost unrecognizable to James. What was once a routine of meetings and corporate decisions had transformed into visits to shelters, meetings with social workers, and long conversations with people whose life stories were so different from his own. He became deeply involved in the work of the foundation, finding a new sense of fulfillment in seeing the real changes his actions were beginning to bring about. The progress of the foundation not only brought him a sense of accomplishment but also the opportunity to reflect on the decisions that had led him to this point. He found himself several times in the midst of crowds of vulnerable people, offering more than just financial help, offering time, empathy, and a listening ear. These interactions humanized him in a way he had never experienced in his business life. The idea of using his business experience to build a sustainable support network for the homeless became his new mission. He knew his fortune was dwindling, but he didn't care. Every decision made, every resource allocated to the foundation was a step toward something that finally made sense. Despite all the challenges, he began to find small victories. The foundation, initially met with skepticism, began to gain recognition. Local news stories started highlighting the work being done on the streets, and more people began to volunteer, bringing new ideas and energy. There was still a long way to go, but the progress, though slow, was palpable. And then, one day, while coordinating one of the foundation's many initiatives, he received an unexpected visit. Sarah, the woman who had triggered all this transformation in his life, appeared at the shelter where he was working. She looked different from the last time he saw her, still tired, but with an expression that suggested a new acceptance, a strength he hadn't perceived before. For a moment, they just looked at each other, as if both were trying to understand what had changed since their last encounter. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I heard about what you're doing," Sarah said. "I wanted to see it with my own eyes." He nodded, not sure what to say. "I don't know if this makes up for everything," he began, but she interrupted him. "I'm not here to talk about making up for anything," she said, her tone firm but not hostile. "I wanted to see if you were really changing, and it seems you are." He felt immediate relief, as if her words had lifted a weight he had been carrying since the day he found her on the streets. "I'm trying," he admitted. "There's still a lot to do, but I'm trying." She looked around, observing the activity in the shelter, the people he was now helping. "You're doing more than most would," she replied. "And that means something." James didn't expect her to completely forgive him, but those words were more than he dared hope for. Her presence there, acknowledging his effort, was a small but significant victory on his path to redemption. He didn't need grand words of forgiveness. That simple gesture of support was enough. The work at the foundation continued to grow, and with it, James found a new perspective on life. He knew he would never be the man he once was, and that comforted him. The experience of losing almost everything, status, wealth, relationships, had transformed him deeply, teaching him the importance of values he once ignored. The foundation became a central focus in his life, and he began to see the impact of his work expand. The people he helped started to find their own paths, whether through jobs, housing, or simply a new sense of dignity. James found renewed joy in every small victory, in every success story that emerged from the darkness. Sarah continued to visit him occasionally, not as an attempt to rekindle something lost, but as a friend who understood the depth of his transformation. They never spoke directly about the past again, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Both had changed, both had found a way to move on. Over time, James realized that Lily had completely left his life, as had many of his former business partners. He didn't blame them, nor did he harbor any resentment. The path he had chosen wasn't for everyone, and he accepted that some losses were inevitable. However, he also gained something much more valuable: a life with purpose, a legacy that would continue to grow and impact the lives of many. The final chapter closes with a scene where James is sitting on a bench, watching the sunset over the city. He reflects on how much his life has changed since he decided to do something for those who needed it most. The journey was difficult, full of sacrifices and pain, but he finally found peace. He knows there is still much to be done, but he is ready to face any challenge that comes in the future. He smiles to himself, feeling a serenity he had never known before. His path to redemption is far from over, but he is content with the man he is becoming. The city, with all its scars and beauty, seems to reflect his dedication, and he feels that he is finally where he belongs, at peace with the past and hopeful for the future.